Hello everyone, welcome to our week 2 of Introduction to Political Science 103. So today I'm going to do my best to keep this short as possible. I'll start directly because I will explain everything that you need to know at the very end of this video recording. So basically this week we are talking about what is politics and what is power, political power, what power means for studying political science or politics. So basically let's start with the question what politics is and why is it important to study politics. So there are different ways to define politics, and for instance you can actually start defining politics as life, really. So it starts kind of in the family. So, for instance, think about your family life, right? When your family needs to make a big decision, consider, for example, whether parents want to hear your voice or not. So this is a very political thing, actually, when you consider it. Of course, it might not necessarily be very important for the general society, but at least it's quite important for your life, or especially individually. Right? So this is kind of a starting point of everything. So then we can actually build on this to define politics and narrow the definition more and more. So next one is politics as power relations. This is exactly what we are focusing right now, especially this week. This is why I think this is quite important to adopt this approach, because when you think from this perspective, I think it is more explanatory to understand or care about politics if you define politics as power relations between individuals, but most importantly between different social groups. So this is something that we'll also talk tomorrow during our 1-hour synchronous session. Another way to define politics is as setting the agenda. So this is what most of the political leaders do, especially the head of the government. For instance, think about when there is an economic crisis, what the leaders do is actually they try to convert the attention of the public to something else. There's actually a big theory about this called diversion reward theory. So whenever there is a big economic problem in the US presidents used to declare war to another country in order to convert the attention of the public to something else. So this is a big power if you think about it, setting the agenda and controlling the media. And then politics is kind of independent leadership. That's also quite important. So leadership is a very important component of the political power. So this is why I actually decided to assign you to read Martin Luther King, who was a very, very important political leader of the civil rights movement at that time. And think about right now, for instance, other leaderships right now you can actually take on. There are some very important names, for example, among the progressive side of the ideological spectrum, but there are also other names you can find in the radical right or white supremacist groups who actually get very famous, and they had kind of a charisma that we actually talk about this in one of our readings. So overall, politics is the distribution and exercise of power. I think this is the easiest way to define politics, and it needs to be, of course, within the society. And the polity, on the other hand, politics, it's different from politics. Polity refers to political institutions through which the power is distributed. So this is quite important because sometimes power is accumulated in or just centered in one hand. So as you can see in many authoritarian systems, but sometimes power is much more distributed among different groups in the society or the leaderships, like in democratic systems. But even though in a very democratic system like the US, there are still some issues in terms of the power distribution. So this is why I think we care so much about systemic racism, because it is a quite important obstacle in front of the distribution of power within the society. This is what we'll discuss tomorrow when we'll discuss Martin Luther King's two very important speeches. So at the end of the day, every society makes some decisions. Some decisions are made regarding the allocation of resources. This is why I think politics and economics come together, because resources almost always are scarce. And everybody or every different societal group want to take their share out of it. But sometimes there is not necessarily an institutional barrier or control on how much one group will take. And of course, this comes to the whole discussion of the human nature, whether we are egoistic, etc. But I don't want to go into detail about this, because we'll talk about this. But at the end of the day, every political system creates winners and losers in every society. And it is over time. And there is also path dependency there. It's a different concept, I know. So path dependency means that the winners of today can create institutions that can continue to benefit them and even their kids in the future. So this is why I think it's very difficult to change the institutions. Think about, for example, how difficult it is to change the US Constitution. You can check it online. I cannot necessarily get into details, but I'm trying to create some curiosity for you to go out there and check. So what is power? Power is the ability to have one's will carried out despite the resistance of others. So power has various shapes. So it can be raw and it can be invisible. Most of the time the power that we'll talk about in this class will be invisible and maybe in the form of persuasion. But of course it can get raw, as raw as, you know, a police brutality. So it is, I think, a crystal clear definition of power, the abuse of power and use of power by one group on other individuals, especially if those individuals are actually constantly from the same group of people. This is why we are actually experiencing the current massive protests going on right now in the US. So another way to put it is actually Robert Dahl, a very important political scientist. He actually made probably the most simplest definition of politics, which is A getting B to do what A wants. So this is very important and very simple definition, and please keep it in mind. And then if we define politics like this, then politics can mean attempting to share power or attempting to influence the distribution of power, right? This is also another way to put it. And what about actors? I think this is a very important part of your discussion for this week. So thinking about actors, maybe individuals, maybe social groups, maybe even countries sometimes. So people who are active in politics strives for power, either as a means in serving other aims, like ideal or egoistic, or as power for power's sake, right? So basically, politicians, when you think about politicians, like the Congress people, right? So they want to get re-elected every year, every 2 years or sometimes 4 years, depending on the Senate or the House. So basically, you can ask the question to yourself, why the politicians want to get re-elected, right? This is a very important part. Is it either for the policy, because they want to serve, or is it because of the fame, or because some other individual interest that they are satisfying? So this is a very important debate in political science as well. But either way, so politics is about the relationship between the ones who rule and the ones who are ruled. So it is about obeying or disobeying. So then the question is, of course, I think it's you can definitely connect it to Martin Luther King. So when are you going to obey? And when are you going to disobey? And of course, disobeying have very different ways. It can be violent, it can be peaceful, but this is a very important part of politics or the political science as well. So this is why I think Max Weber's definition of legitimate authority is very important for us to think about. So the power whose use is considered as just. So this is a very important concept here. Or appropriate. So by those over whom the power is exercised. So what is just power? So how can we define it? Because it can change from person to person. Forget about the social groups, right? It is very difficult. Another way to put it is actually legitimacy is the right to rule. So people have to see it as a right to rule. People have to see that actually the people or the state who is ruling has the right to rule. If people stop saying that actually state or the government has right to rule, then of course it's a very different and difficult situation for that political system, because then people start believing that the power, the authority is legitimate, and this is when actually different groups start to rebel, right? So as I told you before, I'm from Turkey, and we had a long-lasting civil war in Turkey because of the Kurdish militia. So basically, when the Kurdish people, a minority, ethnic minority in Turkey, so they are basically, of course, numbers change, but 13 to 15% of the population. They wanted to have their own cultural and political rights over time. But of course, the governments again and again refused and rejected to give those rights to those people. And at the end of the day, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they started to actually a violent and some people call it terrorist, by kind of an independence movement against the Turkish government and Turkish state. So this is a clear example. Another example is, of course, the Syrian civil war. The system in Syria is also very authoritarian, and the case in Syria is quite different from the Turkish one, because in Syria the minority group is actually ruling over the majority. So we can definitely talk more about this, but I don't want to talk more about in the details. But basically, when you think about the politics as a box, this is what David Easton was talking about. So there are demands, the apathy, and the support. There are inputs that is coming into a kind of a black box, right? The conversion process, the government decision makers are in that box. And then they make some decisions and actions, and they actually lead to some outputs. And those outputs create a feedback that goes to the inputs. And I'm going to show a figure for that. And then actually it is updated, and here you can see the updated version of it. But basically what I'm trying to say is actually it is kind of, we are trying to make it simple. Of course, politics is much more complex than it looks like in this presentation. But as political scientists, our job is actually to make it more simple. And so we'll definitely talk more about this hopefully tomorrow. I'll be waiting for your questions. But in the meanwhile, please read the material and watch the material, because I also upload some videos. And then tomorrow, hopefully, we'll have a nice discussion. And then you'll post your first discussion on discussion forum for week 2. And I wish you a beautiful day, and take care, and hope to see you all tomorrow.